the next thing we're going to need to do is put the wheels back in place on the truck and then secure them in place with the truck sides. Now, this is a little tricky because the wheels don't just pop into place. You have to kind of hold them in place while you put these truck sides on. And if you can see, I'm just kind of setting the wheels in there like that. They're not held in by anything except my hands right now. And what you want to do is get those wheels in place, get one of the truck sides, and at the same time you slide this thing on, you have to hold up this little middle bar here that's jingling around, kind of like that, and slide the side of the truck on so that the needle points on the wheels go into these little holes on the side, and that little bar there that's moving around here in the middle is in the middle of the truck side like that. That way we can put the springs on in just a minute. So it's a little tricky, it takes a little practice. Once you've got it in place, just kind of hold it there with your hand and get one of the screws and secure it in place. There we go. And now you can see that this side of the truck is on. We still have to get this side on. Alright, so now this truck is almost back together. It's rolling around nicely. The only thing we have to do now is put these springs back in. And again, this is where it gets a little scary. To put these springs back into the truck, the first thing you want to do is grab the truck in such a way that you can hold up this bar that's wiggling around here so that it's elevated and gives you the space you need to slide the spring in there. So as you can see, I've got my thumb under here and my index finger on top, and now I've got this nice and open so that I can put the springs back in. So with our trusty tweezers, grab one of the springs. I find it's easier to grab the spring from the top, and you'll notice when you try to put the spring back in, on the bottom end where the spring goes, there's a little nodule sticking out that the spring goes over. And on the top, there's a hole that the spring goes into. So I find it easier to put the spring over the nodule first, and then just carefully let it go up into that hole, like that. And you want to do the exact same thing for all the other springs. Okay, I finished putting in all the springs, and the last thing I want to do is give the top of the truck a little push just to make sure I've got good spring response on both sides of the truck. Make sure there's no springs that are out of alignment or anything. And this truck is done. We've taken a MTH truck and made it coupler free. Now we have to do the exact same thing to the second truck. Now that we've removed the couplers from both of these trucks, we can set them aside and start working on assembling these KD scale couplers. When you take the couplers out of the packaging, they're not going to be assembled like this coupler right here. You have to assemble them yourself. But the couplers come with really good directions on how to do that, so I'm really not going to go over how to put these things together when the instructions already do a really good job of that. And the instructions will also tell you how to prep them with the file and how to lubricate them with this grease and lubricant. But what I will show you is one little trick that I've learned when putting these couplers together, and that is the last step of putting these couplers together is putting this little lid on top of the gearbox. Now my little trick is that I take some super glue and I just put a couple little dabs of glue on the top edge of the gearbox here, and then I secure the lid on top of that, like that. And now that lid is on there very securely. And the reason why I do that is because later on when you're handling this coupler and trying to install it, if you were to let go at any point, this lid would fall off and the spring inside would fly across the room, and you'd spend the rest of the day looking for that little spring on the floor. So by putting the glue on there, the lid is now on there securely, and you're free to work with this coupler any way you need to. And because I've only put a couple little dabs of glue, it's not super permanent, so if I ever needed to remove the lid and work on the inner workings of the gearbox, I could. So now that we've got these two couplers assembled, they're ready to install on the car, except before we install them on the car, we need to put shims on these couplers, and I'm going to show you right now what those shims are for. To help explain to you why we need shims on the couplers, I've put our little O-scale coupler height gauge on my track here, and I've jumped the gun a little bit and installed the KD coupler on the bottom of the MTH car without the shim. And I'm going to roll it up to the gauge, and it couples with it. But if you look closely, you'll see that the coupler on the MTH car is slightly higher than the coupler on the height gauge. So what needs to happen is either the height gauge needs to come up a little bit, which isn't going to happen because that's our standard, or the coupler needs to come down. So in order to lower it, we need to put a little shim in there, and that will lower the coupler down to just the right height. Here's the styrene plastic that we're going to use to make our shim, and if you remember from when I showed you the supplies you're going to need, I said this needed to be 0.06 inches thick. And the reason for that is, after a lot of trial and error, I have found that the 0.06 thickness styrene makes about the perfect shim that brings these couplers to just the right height. So, with your styrene, you want to cut a square shim that's going to fit directly on top of the lid here, and you want to make sure your shim covers both of these screw holes that are on the outside of the coupler. Okay, so now I've created my shims. I use scissors and the X-Acto knife and a small file to create a little square shim that I super glued to the lid of the gearbox, like that. And as you can see, this shim covers up the top of both of these screw holes that are on either side of the gear housing. So now what I'm going to do is take the pin vise and stick it through the other side of the screw hole and drill through real slowly by hand, like that. And the end result is that you now have a screw hole that goes all the way through the styrene shim. And that way, when we fasten this thing onto the car, the coupler and the shim will both be fastened. So I'm going to go ahead and drill the other hole over on this side, and then on the other coupler I'll drill 1, 2 holes there as well. Okay, so now I've finished and I've got 2 holes drilled on each coupler, and I've used this X-Acto knife to trim off any excess plastic that was sticking up as a result of the drilling. So the last thing we need to do is take some black paint and paint all of this white styrene so that it matches the black coupler.